Greetings to you out there. This is Tony Denton coming to you once again from Phoenix, Arizona on this 17th of July 2019. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon here. I just had my lunch after being outside in the heat for a long time this morning. It got up to 115 yesterday. Anyway, I thought I need to figure out a way to get this done, even with these grandkids running around here. So if you happen to hear some grandkids screaming in the background, I'm sorry, I can't do much about it. I have a hard time finding time to do this now with 50 hours of the grandkids around. So, we're on lesson 26 today, installment of my audiobook number 26, called Hebrews From Flawed to Flawed Fulfilled. You can find that book, of course, on my website at asightforthelord.com. Well, it's mentioned on there, but you have to email me about the information on how to get one. Or you can get it on Amazon, but I'd rather get it from me because it alleviates their taking part of my royalties. Okay, well, now that I've put that little plug in there, we're on page 203 of the book, if you're following along, on Hebrews chapter 10, verses 32 through 39. Last week, we finished up through 31, and I mentioned about starting in chapter 11 today. I made a mistake because we still have one more section here in Hebrews 10 to do. So, let's go right on into it now. Page 203, Hebrews 10, 32 through 39. Back in chapter 10, verse 19 is where Paul began applying all his preceding thoughts as well as where he began heading toward his conclusion by writing about Christ's superior principle of faith. Hebrews 10, 19 through 39 concern Christ's faith principle being the only appropriate response to all those superior matters about which Paul had previously written. In fact, verses 19 through 21 sum up everything from chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 18. Then in verses 22 through 25, Paul essentially outlined the next 3 chapters by encouraging faith, hope, and love in his audience of those who were, one by one, deserting Christ. While in verses 26 through 31, where we finished last week, he warned them about the consequences of such a decision. Now in verses 32 through 39, we find a call to perseverance based on God's faithfulness, something Paul actually brought to mind in verse 23. One other thing worthy of note here is that Paul was still repeating himself some. Just as it was previously indicated that verses 26 through 31 are parallel to chapter 6 verses 4 through 8, so now we'll see how verses 32 through 39 are clearly parallel to chapter 6 verses 9 through 12. This means that after he warned them, he attempted to encourage them by expressing the faith in them that they could still turn things around. And it's interesting that this expression of faith in them wasn't based on the fact that other saints had persevered or were persevering, as he went on to deal with in chapter 11, but on the fact that they themselves had once done well under persecution for Christ. Great persecution at that. Okay, so let's begin with chapter 10 of Hebrews, verse 32, page 204 of my book. But recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings. The word recall is in the present not aorist tense, indicating that they were to keep their earlier days as energetic, dynamic Christians ever before them. Let those days of energy and dynamism just keep them focused on where they're headed. You know, it's kind of like that idea in the book of Revelation when Jesus talked about the first love to the church at Ephesus. Keep that first love in your mind and keep pushing and pushing through. The term illuminated simply means that they were made aware of Christ and had accepted him, which in turn means that Paul was referring to a time immediately after they became Christians, a time when they had that initial zeal for Christ, confer chapter 6, verse 4. The phrase great struggle in verse 32 is from the Greek term for the English word athletic. The verb form originally meant to contend in games. So Paul was talking about a fierce conflict with the forces of evil. In fact, according to chapter 12, verse 4, it seems that what they had suffered earlier was as much as could be suffered short of bloodshed. Perhaps they had come through the same difficult circumstances to which Paul alluded in 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 14 through 16, if you want to go read that. And in fact, you might even confer Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. So, moving on to verse 33. Partly while you were made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. The word for spectacle here is from the Greek term for the English expression theater. Yes, as in the Roman amphitheater. However, while the Romans usually used wild beasts against Christians in this public place, the Jews, the chief persecutors of Jewish Christians at this time, publicly brought reproaches and tribulations of other sorts against them. The word tribulations referred to the physical sufferings which included imprisonments. Check out 2 Corinthians 11, 22 through 33, while reproaches referred to the emotional suffering that included false charges. Check out Revelation 16, 13, and 14 with that, which is all reminiscent of how devil means false accuser. Not only were they personally harassed for keeping Jesus as the Messiah, but they were also harassed for emotionally supporting, physically harboring, and even financially aiding others who were being persecuted for accepting Jesus as the Christ. Go back to chapter 6, verse 10 for more about that. Alright, verse 34. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. As most other versions support, the best manuscripts omit the personal pronouns, making it read, you had compassion on those in prison, which actually corresponds better to the context. Paul is reminding them of the early days of their Christianity, likely a reference to a time 30 years earlier, and a time when the Apostle Paul was still the Pharisee Saul. The word compassion here in verse 34, like the word visit in James 1:27, carries with it some type of action, perhaps even the same action as the word visit in James. In other words, the word visit doesn't mean to merely pop in on people, but to actually physically help those in need with food, medicine, clothing, etc. In fact, it appears that at that time and place in history, the needs of prisoners weren't provided by the government, meaning that prisoner provisions were made by family and friends. The term plundering here in verse 34 brings to mind a seizure or a confiscation, implying two motives. It could refer to a mere form of persecution, or it could, and likely does, refer to disinheritance as a Jew. See, in the eyes of apostate Israel, when a Jew forsook Moses for Jesus, his share of the property was withheld from him, and his credit and every source of gain was withdrawn. Revelation 13, 16 through 17 fits what we're saying here. Such makes one wonder if this could have been the reason for the event in Acts chapter 4, 34 and 35, and Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Actually, non-Christian Jews were considered apostate Israel because they were the ones who forsook Moses. Why? Because if they truly believed Moses, they would have accepted Jesus, for Moses wrote of him, John 5:46. Besides, isn't this why Jesus called apostate Jews the synagogue or the church of Satan in Revelation 2:9 and Revelation 3:9? Because they were actually the ones who forsook the true Moses. Well, getting back to the motive, surely it's also possible that Paul meant to include both motives, to persecute them and to confiscate their possessions in order to disinherit them. The question is, how could they endure these joyfully? Because they knew they had a superior eternal possession on its way from heaven, Revelation 22 verse 2 that Paul's talking about here in the book of Hebrews. Jesus once said in Matthew 5:10 and Matthew 6:19 through 20, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. And he also said earlier, chapter 5 of Matthew verses 10 through 12, blessed or joyful are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Well, now that Paul has reminded them of God's past faithfulness to them under difficult circumstances, hardships that they even had come through without bloodshed, he continued to encourage them to keep on keeping on based on God's future faithfulness. Connected to Matthew 5 verse 12 that we just read, verse 35 goes on to say, therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has a great reward. Paul is urging these brethren to not discard that wondrous confidence they possessed back in the beginning of their Christian walk. This is reminiscent of chapter 3 verse 6, where he told them to hold fast their confidence to the end. when the reward of reconciliation and righteousness would be attained. Per chapter 11, verse 1, that we'll get to next week, confidence is faith-induced. And in Ephesians 6, verse 16, Paul referred to faith as the shield in a soldier's armor. What's interesting about this is that he may have been alluding to the conduct of weak and cowardly soldiers who, in a day of battle, would throw aside their shields and retreat, something considered especially dishonorable. The phrase great reward in verse 35 brings to mind 1 Corinthians 15:58, where Paul wrote, "Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing your labor is not in vain in the Lord." All right, verse 36. "For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise." Just as the faith of chapter 11 was brought to mind in verse 35, now the fortitude of chapter 12 is brought to mind in this verse 36. In chapter 12, verses 5 through 8, Paul wrote, "My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons." The phrase "the will of God" in verse 36 speaks to their continued faithfulness to the Christ by persevering under all their trials for His sake. This blending of confidence in verse 35 and endurance here in verse 36 in connection with the attainment of the pledged prize was found earlier in chapter 6 verse 12, which reads, "Do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." So if they wanted to be good little children and not be cut out of their Father's will with the promise of a great reward, check out Romans 11 about that, then these Christian Jews simply needed to persevere a little while longer. In fact, quoting Habakkuk chapter 2 verses 3 and 4, he goes on to say in verses 37 and 38 of Hebrews 10, "For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him." After Habakkuk asked God a question and said something about his judgment against his people Israel in chapter 1 verse 12, God replied, "The vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry." Paul began his application of this prophecy here saying, "yet a little while," a very strong phrase in the Greek meaning yet a little, ever so little while. Check out other versions like the NIV, the NASB, Young's Literal Translation, and so on. In fact, the Greek term mikron, where we get micro, is used here for the word little. Now consider this. In John 16 through 22, when Jesus talked to his disciples about their future suffering for a little while, he used the same term as Paul did when he told them that in a little while, mikron, they wouldn't be able to see him. That is, he'd leave them at his ascension. Then after another little while, mikron, they would see him again. That is, he'd return for them. John 14, 2 and 3, John 16, 22, etc. talk about that. So this second little while is what Paul is writing about here in Hebrews. That period, that little while of suffering, was so far gone now at the time Paul was writing Hebrews in AD 63, he could add the phrase hoson, which is very, very, meaning that it literally reads a very, very little while. A little while before this, Paul told the Christians in Rome that the night is far spent, the day is at hand, Romans 13:12. This phraseology clearly indicates that Paul wasn't writing about something 2,000 years away, but something more like 5 to 7 years away. In other words, not talking about our time or something future to our time, but something really close to his time, 5 to 7 years maybe. And what would that be? Christ's AD 70 coming against apostate Israel, of course. Just check the context, verses 25 and following, as we talked about in the last study. After all, this is the coming that would bring major relief to these brethren. Check out Revelation 6, 11 and 12, and even 2 Thessalonians 1, 6 through 8 about that very idea. And I have a study on my website on the context of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 that's very interesting and fun. Not only would it bring relief from Jewish persecution, but since the old physical city of God, Jerusalem, would be razed, R-A-Z-E-D, to the ground, it also alleviate the temptation to return to Judaism. The phrase "the just" literally means here in verse 38, the just one. And anyone, the word anyone, should be translated as he. In other words, the verse would better say, God said, if he, the just one, draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him, implying, as the entire book does, that a saved person can become lost again. Yes, again, another verse out of so many in the book of Hebrews that teach against Calvinism. Furthermore, the just shall live by faith phrase is in contrast to the if he draws back phrase, signifying that the phrase live by faith here means that he who would escape that judgment would do so due to his faith or faithfulness, and of course the grace of God. Here's a side note for you. It's interesting that Paul quoted Habakkuk 2:4 various times. In Romans 1:17 he used it to emphasize the just part of it. In Galatians 3:11 he used it to emphasize the shall live part of it. Then here in Hebrews 10:38, he used it to emphasize the by faith part of it. In fact, chapters 11 through 13 could be considered a discussion on living by faith. All right, moving on. The term pleasure here in verse 38 comes from the word please. Thus, God, through Habakkuk, was saying that the one who chose to become his child, then deserted his Christ, would very much displease him. In other words, God wouldn't be able to find anything in his entire being, that is, in his soul, that would keep him from judging this man along with all the other Jews who rejected his son. In fact, as Peter wrote, it would be better for him not to have known the way of righteousness at all than having known it and then turned from it. 2 Peter 2, verse 21. All right, last verse of Hebrews chapter 10, verse 39. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. The phrase draw back refers to the desertion of Christianity. The word perdition refers to utter permanent destruction, the very thing promised and prophesied of Jerusalem, indicating that those who drew back would do so to their own destruction. Just check out Zechariah chapters 12 through 14. The word saving here may mean preserving or acquiring. You choose which. In this context, I prefer the latter, acquiring. The term soul here not only doesn't have the definite article before it in the original, but it's also the same as in verse 38, referring to life as opposed to death, which in this case may include both physical and eternal death. Thus, more literally this verse might read, we are not for the retreating to destruction, but for faith to the acquisition of life. So, with the we in mind, pronoun we, it's as if Paul had worked himself up at this point to conclude this paragraph with what appears to be a pep rally statement of inspiration. Picture him on the floor of a basketball court speaking to a discouraged team. Paul says, "What are we going to do?" Paul and the team say, "We're going to win." Paul says, "What are we going to do?" Paul and the team both say, "We're going to win." Back and forth. We're going to win. On page 210 of the book, the last page that has to do with the installment that we're talking about right now, with this installment of the study through verse 39, I have a picture of a triangle with Paul in the middle of it saying, "How can we neglect so great a salvation?" And then around that triangle and call-outs, statements throughout the book of Hebrews. Don't drift away. Don't neglect your salvation. Don't depart. Don't fall away. Don't cast away your confidence. Don't harden your heart. And so on. So Paul's just all through the book trying to encourage these people who are in the habit as a group of falling away, of leaving one at a time and going back to Moses, or at least they believe that's who they're going back to, or the persecutors are trying to make them think they're going back to. And he's saying, stick with it. How can you neglect such a great salvation? Don't depart. Don't fall away. Okay. Then I'm going to move now to page 310 and read my translation of this section that we just studied. Page 318, verse 32 through 39 of Hebrews chapter 10. So continue recalling the early days in which, after being enlightened, you endured a great struggle of sufferings, sometimes being subjected as in a theater to scoldings and persecutions, and sometimes becoming supporters of those enduring such. For you had compassion on those in prison. In fact, knowing that you have a better and permanent possession in the heavens, you even joyfully suffered the seizure of your property. Don't therefore discard that confidence which has great reward. You need this endurance so that you may carry out God's will and receive the fulfillment of the promise. For only in a very, very little while the coming one will come without tarrying along the way. And my righteous one will live due to his faith, but nothing in my being will find delight in him if he retreats. We, however, are not of those who retreat to utter destruction, but of those who are acquiring life by faith. All right, that's installment number 26 of my audiobook of my book, Hebrews From Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. And I thank you so much for being with me again this week. I look forward to sharing with you the first part of a 4-part series on chapter 11 next week. Have a great week.